in a while, you get to read a book that really hits home. And this one definitely was for me, The Emperor's Orphans by Sally Ito. And it is a great honor and a pleasure to actually, well, I guess the better thing would be, Sally, for you to be right here in the same room. But no, thank you so much for joining us on Hugh at Home. Welcome. And thank you for this book. And I know that it deals with a lot of Japanese history, but really, Sally, all families are so alike, and I think share the same kind of beliefs and stories, hidden stories, secrets. But once you truly learn more about your family, I think it really truly helps you find out more about yourself. And especially if you do have family yourself, then right, it makes the story complete. So let's go back. Let's talk about The Emperor's Orphans and how it all began for you, because it really is quite a revelation, I think, in its sense, too, for you.
Yeah, well, for me, I always did kind of, as a writer, wanted to write about my family and the family history. Um, but it was just, it was how to do it. And I was very conscious that I thought my story wasn't really that important. I thought it was important to tell the story of my Japanese Canadian great aunt and my parents who had been through the war and through it being interned and then exiled to Japan. And I also wanted to talk about my mother's family who had been in Japan during the war. And I didn't really think my voice was very important. But as I wrote it, I realized more and more that I needed to be a voice because I was the storyteller,
Mm-hmm.
and I needed to know. I needed to be part of this narrative. So the book is set up in such a way that there are the important storytellers, my great aunt and my maternal grandfather, Toshiro. And then there's me, just sort of explaining who they are and how they influenced me and what they thought.
Oh, so I wanted to ask, though, a little bit into the history, because I just, again, recently found out. I mean, we knew and understood about the redress and the internment, but there was another part of that too, where the government was ready to ship Japanese Canadians who were born in Canada back to Japan, and like you say, exiled. And this was a very important part of your book. So that didn't necessarily happen in my family, but I found it interesting in how, when they got to Japan, it wasn't. They were foreigners, in a
Yes.
definitely.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Well, the interesting thing about the repatriation policy, as it was called, was that people were making decisions because they were dispossessed of their property and they couldn't return to the West Coast. And this was a thing that was different between the Americans and the way that Japanese Americans were treated and Japanese Canadians were treated was this repatriation option. And it contributed to to the exiling of people like my grandmother, who was Canadian by birth, and my father and his brothers, who were born in Canada. As effectively, it was a kind of exile. They had really no say in the decision, so it was kind of that sort of situation.
Yeah. And for yourself too, I guess, growing up, Sally, if we talk about the way you felt and your own family life, and you talk about assimilation and just fitting in, and wearing all the modern clothes and everything like that. And I kind of think about too, I mean, we did grow up in the exact same era. And for me, I guess I consider myself fortunate. I didn't feel any different, but it's it's always a different situation for any other person too as well. So for you, what was it like for yourself growing up?
Well, I grew up in Alberta in the predominantly white suburb of
Mm-hmm.
Sherwood Park, just outside of Edmonton. So I was quite conscious that I was really like, really one of the few Asian kids in my entire high school. It was a big high school. There were other racial minorities there, of course, but overall, I would say that it was more or less white. There were maybe a few Black students, a few South Asian students, And there were also other Japanese Canadians that had come from southern Alberta. But I felt like I was in a sea of whiteness, and you're not really thinking that consciously about it. But as you get to your high school and stuff, you do start to notice things, like that. And I was going to Japanese language school, and I was aware that I was always speaking Japanese at home. And so the culture was different at home than it was outside. So there was, there was that kind of bifurcated sense of being in two worlds.
Yeah, so I mean, and that's interesting too because you did keep up your Japanese, going to Japanese school, learning about the culture, speaking it. Um, so, what was it, or when was it that you really wanted to learn more about yourself, and that you wanted to learn more about your heritage?
Well, I would say it was probably in high school. I really sensed by that point that I needed to go to Japan. Like I felt like that's where everything was. That's where the language was. That's where people that looked like me were, and people that looked like my mom were. So I was taken to Japan in high school by my father for a 2-week trip, and after that, I was just hooked. I couldn't wait until I could go back again, and then I did a gap year in Japan, after high school,
Mm-hmm.
and that desire never stopped. Like I still continue wanting to go to Japan, and yeah, so that it started in high school and just never really stopped. Yeah.
And then you took your family back there.
Yes.
What was that whole experience like? Because by then, I mean, the story was almost, you had all your information almost and being able to share now with your family. What was that like?
Well, that was really interesting because, I never grew up in Japan. I never experienced childhood in Japan. But I really wanted my kids to have an experience of that. So I took them in 2011, and we went twice, in 2007 and 2011. And I had heard that in order for the language to sort of really be rooted in a child, you should have them immersed in the language at least once or twice before the age of 12. So I really did have that in mind, and I thought I really wanted to have my children exposed to that. So they had an experience that I've never had, which was to go to elementary school in Japan, and junior high school for my son at that time. And they had a really interesting experience, and they understood what it was like to be a mixed race kid from Canada in Japan in a Japanese school. And I think that was a very unique experience for them.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's like role reversal. What, and I guess, on all your times going back to Japan, did you notice a change in the people, or is it always the same? Like somehow I've only been there once, and I kind of think that it's almost like it's frozen in time, and they're just the same, very stoic and
Yes.
busy and and super clean. But
Yes.
have you noticed a change though with everything that's
Oh,
happening in the world? Yes.
Oh yeah, definitely. When I was there in my gap year in high school, I would get into the train and everybody's heads were black. So I felt like I would describe the stream flowing out of the subway cars and trains as being a river of black heads. And then really the next time I went, everybody was dyeing their hair, right? So I mean, you had blue and blonde and pink, and I think this is what's so fascinating about Japanese culture too, is it's kind of always undergoing this change, and you kind of have to keep going there to witness that change, and I think maybe for Japanese Canadians who have only been there like once a year, it's kind of locked in your memory, and there's this kind of sense that the traditional things are what represent Japan. Whereas in Japan, it's just this kind of complex mixing and matching of things. And a lot of the times, traditional things are losing, they're losing their hold on Japanese people. But interestingly enough, the Japanese Canadians and Japanese North Americans are looking to the traditional and are amazingly keeping it alive in North America in a way that it may not be happening in Japan. Yeah.
No, and I think it's learning about all those stories definitely. I maybe want to just digress from the book a little bit, Sally, and just sort of talk about the issues and the racism that
Yes.
is very prominent right now, especially towards Asians. And it's just, how do you kind of deal with it? What are your views on it? Obviously, it's if you boil it down to it's, people just they don't understand, and they're allowing their own ignorance to kind of come to the surface. But I mean, a lot of this is really awful, and always it's usually pointed toward elderly, which is a really growing concern.
Yeah, I was really surprised by the attacks on elderly people in the U.S. And I think also we're seeing a lot of it because we're all connected on social media. And I had an interesting sort of moment of like I was watching this, but I felt people were asking me, "Are you feeling any racism here?" And I think, well, no, I don't. I'm not feeling it. I don't feel it in the same way. But then at the same time as I was thinking about this, I'm on the community council for the Landscapes of Injustice project, which is a huge project is looking at the dispossession of Japanese Canadians. And they just launched their digital archive. And so I was able to go into my family's papers. And when I look at the letters that were exchanged between the custodian's office and my great aunt, and other people were talking about their experiences of going into the archive, you can really see the racism. You can see the bureaucratic antipathy towards Japanese Canadians. You can see how the way the custodian wrote about their lands and how they devalued their lands and said that they were messy and unkempt. And that was not true at all. In fact, but they would write it that way so that they could devalue the property and then sell it for a lot less than it was worth. And I just thought, wow, that's this. Of course, we come from a legacy of this, and I've just completely forgotten about that. Then I needed to tell my kids that. I said, like, do you know that this is what happened to your great aunt and your grandparents? It was there in the past, and it's rearing its head again. So you need to be aware that you come from a legacy of that, and you might think that you're not facing any racism now, but I think you need to also know that your story has some of that in there.
Yeah. And I mean, it is in our nature and culture to, you know, be very passive, stoic, not complain, just go with the flow.
Yes.
This is so Asian. and,
Yes.
and
No,
I
it's
mean,
true. It's
and
true.
yeah. And so I guess maybe words of wisdom or whatever, Sally, because I mean, that's your profession, words. And
Yes.
words can
Yes.
be so good. And it's just like, oh, I wish I said that. Um,
Yeah.
because now, I mean, like if we see it, we have to act on it. But
Yeah.
on the other hand, safety is a factor, right? And there's that part of us, we're just saying, okay, let's maybe stick our heads in the sand and it'll all go away.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Well, there's it's interesting because I think that it is true with Japanese people generally. They have that saying, the nail that sticks out gets hammered down. And we have the saying in English, the squeaky wheel gets the oil,
Yeah.
right? I mean, and those two, and also there's a in Japanese culture, there's an idea that it's better to be like a bamboo, which is to sway,
Yeah.
sway with
Ben.
the tide, and then you won't be broken, right? Because as so, and I think there's a lot to be appreciated in that thinking in the culture. But one thing I did realize when I was working with the Landscapes of Injustice project was that there were a number of very angry people, Japanese Canadians, who wrote letters to the government and who wrote letters to the custodian, who took the country to the Supreme Court. And I think we, as Japanese Canadians, need to say, yes, we have a legacy of being angry and standing up for ourselves, and don't think that we shouldn't act on that legacy too. Let's not bury that. It was there, and now that it's been uncovered, let's look to that legacy and say this is how we can speak up again, because actually some of our Nisei elders did that.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And you know what? I guess lastly, or as to wrap things up, for yourself, Sally, I mean, to be able to write a family story is pretty incredible. But you must have changed a lot too in this whole process.
Oh yeah, I did a lot, and it's continuing all the time. Like even having once more again access to my family's archives digitally has just opened up new thoughts, new ideas. I was able to share those with family members, and I was able to share them with my children, which is a really valuable thing. And so I feel like it's you can never be tired in a way of your family story because it's constantly evolving. And I realize now my children are mixed race, and that's a whole different ball game of identity that I don't know and I don't really understand, and that's another place I want to explore, with them.
Oh, because yes, they are the way of the future, and we do have children too that are mixed race, and yeah, I think another book on that alone would be, something that I think that everybody, should share and read. And although this is the Ito family history, um, it's anybody's family, I think, and especially when
Yes.
you're going back to the motherland or anything like that, and to learn more about your culture, I think will be the first steps towards anti-racism, right? Learning about other cultures and understanding. So hopefully a book like this, I think a book like this should be in schools, really.
Yes, well, yeah, thank you. I
Yeah.
hope so. I hope it gets read in schools too. There's an Italian anthropologist who said there's no such thing as race, there's only culture. And I thought that was a very interesting comment. I think it's so true. And we grow up with other cultures around us, and we have to be mindful of that, and we have to be inquisitive about that. And sometimes we might be blunt with our questions and kind of rude, but we have to have a dialogue, and we have to just not think of them as that other stranger that looks different or that's on the other side of the road or is in some other place, but we're having an encounter with them, so we need to have curiosity and engage in conversation with people other than ourselves.
Oh, most definitely. Well, it's pretty hard in this pandemic and isolation,
Yeah.
but thank goodness for Zoom.
Yeah, yes.
Well, it's been so wonderful to meet you, Sally. Can't wait for the next book, and thank you personally. It meant a lot. So, The Emperor's Orphans, I would suggest getting it. It's a great little read. And once again, Sally Ito, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Tracy.